Hi guys, I'll be saying Mr. Beast 1,000 times, so let's just get it. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Bates, 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 Mr. Bates. So let's count how much we've done so far. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79. Mr. Beast. So we're at 80. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mace, Mace, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Bates, 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 Mr. Mace, Mr. Bates, 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 Mr. Bates. This is way harder than I ever thought, guys. Let's do it again. Mr. Bates, 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 Bates, Mr. 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 Bates. Mr. Bates, 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 what the hell? Mr. Bates, Mr. Bates, Mr. Bates, Mr. Bates, Mr. Bates, Mr. Bates, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. And guys, we just hit 700, 300 more. Here we go. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my god, guys, this is taking me so long. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Okay, we're at 750. Oh my god. Mr. Beast, 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 760, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, 770, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh my god, I can't say it. Mr. Beast, Mr. Bates, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. We are at 790. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Okay, guys, we have just hit 800 times saying it. Okay. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. This is I've only done a couple of videos, but this is the weirdest I've ever done and the hardest. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Okay, we're at 820. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. We're at 830. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Okay, we have hit our 850 mark. Okay, come on. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast. Oh my god. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Bates, Mr. Beast, Mr. Bates, 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 Mr. Bates. Okay, 875. Mr. Bates, 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 Mr. Bates. Okay, guys, I'm from a little break, and we just hit 950. Oh my God. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. We're at 975. Oh my God. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Okay, I'm back. 999 and Mr. Beast. 1,000 times I have said Mr. Beast, and bye.